Hello and welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Today on the show, we're talking about Nickel Boys, the new film from director RaMell Ross. It's based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel about two young African-American men incarcerated in a reform school in Florida in the 1960s. This conversation was recorded this past September as a live panel discussion at the New York Film Festival. It's part of our support of the Artist Academy program, where we bring conversations about the art and craft of filmmaking to the next generation of directors. We're grateful to our friends at the New York Film Festival and Film at Lincoln Center for this fantastic collaboration. Joining our discussion is the film's co-writer and director, RaMell Ross, as well as composers Scott Alario and Alex Summers, and supervising sound editors and re-recording mixers Daniel Timmons and Tony Vallant. We do discuss some spoilers, so if you haven't had a chance to see the film yet, I encourage you to do so before listening to this episode, and hopefully you can do it in a cinema that has great sound and picture. Nickel Boys has gained a lot of attention for its use of first-person point of view to tell the story. We're so accustomed to the language of cinema being an omniscient third-person camera that most people have never even considered that film can be told in the first person from the point of view of the main character, like in a novel. So that's where I started our conversation, by asking RaMell about his decision to use first-person POV.
To me, to look out of my body is like the realest thing I've ever experienced, you know? I didn't imagine the same for you. People of color, to speak for all of them, because that's my thing. Every person of color has to be, I think, devastated when they look out at popular production culture, and it's like quite difficult to glimpse their subjectivity, our subjectivity, which I think because the default is the other. And reading Colson's novel, it didn't make any other sense. Like, that was the first idea, you know, because I'm Elwood and Turner, as Colson is also Elwood and Turner. It made sense. It's strange. Like, the visuals are quite easy in that sense, because that's how I see myself in the world, and so I just give that to the big screen, and then that's when it's something strange. And the fact that it's strange is part of the problem. The fact that that's revolutionary, specifically to see through a person of color's body, is a huge, huge issue. Like, why is it 100 years into cinema where we're just thinking about what it means to approach an individual who's been determined to be of a certain race, that their subjectivity is like, whoa, I can't believe, like, that's crazy to me, you know? And you recognize it right away.
Tell me a little bit about the process of just figuring out the shots, because what does your shot look list like, you know, in this sense? And there's so many just brilliant images, like the marble coming down the stairs that just are kind of haunting to me. And so, but were those happy accidents that you figured out on set, or was that, you know, how much of that did you have figured out ahead of time?
I'd say about 95 to 98% of the images were scripted. They were written as the language of the film before the script was written. The original script was a series of images and image movements. The images were called adjacent images. They were like one step removed. This is way too nuanced. Like one step removed from narrative thrust. And they're just more poetic ways of being in the world and seeing the world. And then they're like appended or preceded by scenes. And this is just the same form as Hell County This Morning, This Evening, if you all are familiar with it, which everyone here worked on. The marble one was one that came as we got there. You know, we're like, we need additional adjacent images. And, you know, we go to the Dozier archive, sadly, for inspiration. And of course, they uncovered hundreds of marbles that boys had near their bodies in the graves. And so I'm sure you all realize it's very, very, very dense. It's like a compact sort of almost encyclopedia of sort of movements and ideas. But all the objects, all of the things are coming from the source material, trying to sort of pay some sort of homage to the people who unfortunately are nameless.
You mentioned that you've worked with all of these amazing artists on your previous film, Hell County This Morning, This Evening, which is, I feel like in some ways, Nickel Boys is an evolutionary step in the next progression of the language that you established in that film. Can you talk a little bit about, since you knew that they were going to be joining you on this journey, at what point did you involve them in the process? Did they read the scripts before you went and shot? Like how did you get them involved and get that kind of creative process going for both sound design and for music?
Well, it's quite difficult because while I love collaboration after making this film, I like separation. Like, I like for people to do their thing. I wanted Scott, Alex, Dan, and Tony individually to do what they wanted to do, and then collaborate together to do what they wanted to do. So I don't want to overburden them with all the ideas of the film. And what we're going to do is we're going to allow for the camera to be correspondent to both the audience and the character. This collapse of, and so I want the sound to do that. It would be natural to like overburden them with some of the stuff that we're trying to do, but it's like each individual, like their life experience and the way that they think about the world through their mediums, that provides that contrast that like opens up the film, that like does all the things that I can barely articulate that I noticed when we worked on Hell County. And so, of course, in practical reasons, we had Dan and Tony aware of that we were shooting single point perspective, and how do we make sure we get our sound that's going to give you guys the best chance to do what you want. So, of course, Dan's doing his research. We should have a mic here. We need to do this one might be too heavy. And, Tony's advising Dan, doing the thing. And then these two also are getting familiar with the story itself, and knowing that they have to give them a head start because, these guys are like super prolific. And they also, like, Scott's a almost full-time professor, also has his own art practice. Alex is working on albums with other folks. Like, they're kind of almost doing this as a favor because we like enjoy working together so well, and that Hell County was such a moving experience for us. So they needed a lot of leeway. Like, they didn't get like a month. Like, they knew for like 8 months that they were doing this, so they could like already start thinking.
So Scott and Alex, did you start? You started thinking about it. Did you start working and composing before you got picture, or what was the sort of the gestational process for you with this film?
We did. It was the first and only time I've been invited to the set of a film. So that's rare for a composer. So Scott and I were really excited about that, to be included at that level, because we're both very visually motivated, I think. We prepared a bunch of music that was quite rough, but we were dying to get RaMell in a room and say, we've been thinking about the film, and we brought a little rig with little speakers, and it was quite dinky. So we were thinking about it from as soon as RaMell let us know what he was making, and he sent us a script, and we read it, and then we prepared as much music as we could in a short period of time. We flew to New Orleans, and we visited the set, and we got like a long lunch with RaMell at some point where everyone wanted to grab him. We're like, just for a second.
Is this one where we sat on the curb outside?
Yeah. We played him some music.
Yeah, we were in a trailer and we had like a little speaker and we played him what we had done. And I think it was probably like out of context. You were overstimulated. You were doing so many things. You had been shooting for a few weeks. Everybody had COVID. It was crazy. It was wild times. But yeah, it was New Orleans. It was so cool. And then, yeah, we played you music in the trailer, and it was fun to like, I think RaMell trusted us a lot, and we're so grateful for that, and like so lucky to work with him, and we trust him as well. So he was kind of just like you said, do your thing. And we did do a lot of music beforehand.
And how close is what we heard in the final track to those sort of initial kind of explorations that you did? I'm always just fascinated to find out how did the music evolve? Did you guys go down some blind alleys, some things that you tried that didn't work out? Tell us a little bit about the evolution of the track.
Yeah, it's pretty different, because we wanted to work fast and quick and instinctual. But then, of course, once we got into the weeds of it, we started to understand what it was, and we opened it up. So RaMell and Nick, the picture editor, were super involved in the music. So we would make a few things and stem out the layers and share it with them so they could strip it back even further. RaMell is an expert at Restraint, and you just see one tiny detail and it's kind of so moving. So he did that even with the music, pulled it back. So sometimes you're hearing just one layer out of like 12 of something we made. And then you'd send it back and we'd be like, oh my God, that's way cooler.
Yeah, so it was surprising to hear some of that stuff. We were just impressed and blown away and just like inspired again. And then they would just like maybe use a bass line from something we made. And then we could kind of go back and be like, whoa, that's really cool. And what can we do to add to that?
Daniel and Tony, I'm curious for you, this first person POV, what possibilities did that open up for you from a sound design perspective in terms of how you were going to use the sound to tell this story?
I mixed the dialogue. Dan mixed all the sound effects and dialogue and music. We mixed together. From a dialogue perspective, we had numerous conversations with RaMell about coming up with a unique cinematic way to show the first person, but not be too heavy with it so that it is overbearing. But so you wouldn't get tired of it. It'd be subtle, and certain points maybe we treat it a little bit more than others. But we wanted it to be lifted off the screen just a little bit, and we played with a couple of different ideas. Ultimately, for me, I found that mixing in stereo from the get-go and finding something that sounded really great in headphones. So I did a lot of mixing in headphones because what I found is first of all, the Dolby room sounds awesome here. Thanks for showing it here. I listened to a little bit of it here, and it was thrilled to hear it in here. But what I found when we started mixing in Atmos, super wide with the dialogue, trying to do the POV sound, that when I would listen to it in mixed down versions to 5.1 in stereo, it didn't quite hold up the way I wanted it to. So I wanted to make absolutely sure that in stereo, where a lot of people are going to be listening to the movie, that it would hold up. I found what worked ultimately in stereo that would upmix. So I kind of did a reverse. Usually we do things, in Atmos and check them in stereo, but I did the reverse. I did stereo and checked it in Atmos.
I'd love for you to talk just a little bit more about that, because I did have a question about, I love the way you treated the first Elwood's voice, and then obviously Turner when we go to his POV. You did a vocal treatment on their voices, because of course our voices sound very strange to us in our own head. But I appreciate what you just said. Like, you probably went too far. It took a while to sort of figure out what was going to feel right.
Absolutely, yeah. It started super wide, super big. And I'm thinking, oh, this has to sound like it's, surrounding my whole head or something. And it just didn't translate well, and just had to, and got tiring in the track. Didn't want that to be the overbearing thing. There's so much information in the film, visually and sound wise, that this just wanted to be a little piece of it and not be the main focus of the POV.
And Daniel, for you, this gave you some pretty interesting opportunities to play with the sound field in terms of the sound design and the effects. Can you talk a little bit about the POV aspect of it?
The POV thing is crazy, right? I think, can I do the emotion? Can I get the emotional off my back first before I do the technical? I think working with you, RaMell, is like one thing, but to see it in the world is crazy. And I can now see like your guiding principles that reined us in with this. Like, it's so amazing that like someone so open-hearted as you has like invited people to share this POV together in the room. Like, no one's ever done that before. And the trust that you gave to us to just do what we have to do is like only exceeded by the trust that you've given the audience members to share this and interpret this from all the different angles. It's so crazy. And it's just so, that's the precedent. The precedent has been set there, and that is so cool.
Thank you.
The door is open now. I think it's
Thank you.
So the technical thing, I knew it was different, from the get-go. So my thought was to use this new technology, the Atmos thing, to treat it opens up the door for each speaker to be treated differently. And that's like poetic in its own, crazy way too. Each, not that there's one good spot to sit or one good place to hear, but like each speaker is going to have its own equal footing. So instead of mixing the usual way where we're moving, kind of prescribing points around in a cube, I decided to mix into like a sphere. Put a cube into a sphere was the kind of, cube fell into a square hole. I don't know, whatever. So anyway, it worked out very interesting in a way that it kind of like also removed a little bit of control for me. It was hard to use. So introduced a little bit of randomness into the process, which I like, and also gave things just a whole different context for what it means for sound to be coming at you, or it made it more like you're part of a sound. Mm-hmm. Thing that's alive, and that was fun to work with. If you looked at my meters, it would be a little different than normal. Like the meter for each of the surround channels versus the front would be equal. I'm hitting all the speakers with the same amount of energy, but it's just out of phase and different in a way because it's in a ambisonic sphere that's been like kind of decoded down so that we're kind of getting hit by equal pressure from all angles, which I think is also kind of tied into the ethos.
I really appreciated the way you leaned into it too. I mean, almost from the very beginning of the movie, when Elwood is laying in the grass and looking up into the fruit trees, and I got a sense of that space with the insects and the just the sound of the wind moving through the tree, and it immediately it just said to me, okay, well, the sound is going to be giving me Elwood's POV as well as the image is going to be giving me the POV. So I just thought it was a really remarkable track. You must have spent a lot of time working on ambiences and a lot of stuff that you would not necessarily be forefront in the track otherwise.
It was fun because I adopted part of Tony. Tony's my mentor for years, 15 years now, I think. So I adopted his process of like just touching each sound and placing it in its little world. But it was fun to do it in this 3D sphere this time around. So that was the process. It was fun.
I want to say quickly that the way that RaMell shoots his films, I know that you're thinking about sound all the time. And like the marble scene that you talked about, like, I mean, that's like a sound designer's dream, that, coming up with that long marble bouncing stuff. And RaMell has tons of that in the film, where he knows that sound is going to be such a big part of it as well. And that's just makes it so fun for us to work on your films. Thank you.
For Scott and Alex, I just wanted to ask you about kind of the instrumentation that you chose. And I am not a composer, so I don't know what I'm talking about when I ask these kind of questions. But I made a note when I watched the film, like in the car ride, when they get picked up, I felt like the music was almost like birds. I'm sort of interested in the instrumentation that you guys chose. How did you? It's a very organic track, and I'd love for you to talk about sort of the formulation of that.
Scott made loads of field recordings, which is something as a film composer, you can't put field recordings as music in a film because the first person who would witness it would say, you can't do that because that's not what's happening on screen. So I'll let Scott tell you what he did, but he just made loads of field recordings that don't make sense. But life doesn't make sense. And it's so poetic and powerful when Scott did what he did. And that's a good example of it.
When RaMell asked us to work with him again, I was so excited because a few years had gone on since after Hale County, and Alex had kind of developed a career as a film composer and had a ton of credits under his belt and has really kind of learned this world. But I didn't do that. I kind of have gone on my own path. And so I don't know any of the rules. So I was, making field recordings and thinking like this could work because I didn't know that could compete with sound design or dialogue or be weird or whatever. But I had no idea. So I think the naivete there helped, I guess, to like just take risks.
Frogs, not birds.
Oh yeah,
so in that scene, it's a field recording that Scott made.
They're spring peepers. They're little frogs, tiny frogs making sound.
So I wasn't wrong. There are animals in this, in the music of the film.
It's funny that the marble keeps coming up because I don't even know if it came from you or maybe it's in the book or something. But something about things spinning. I kept imagining the sound of rotation, and I kept wanting to record things that were spinning. So we did field recordings of some toys, like toys that make melody that spin, like tops, and like other things that spin, and fans. We recorded a fan on set in a bathroom that sounded really cool.
It sounded really cool. We kept going to the bathroom and be like, did you hear that fan? Yeah, it's amazing. We're like, what if we record it and be like, it'll never make the cut. It's definitely in there.
But yeah, so we kind of just kept pushing against each other. I'd be like, what about this? And Alex would be like, yeah, RaMell might like it. He's like, RaMell's his own person.
RaMell has his own relationship to like the non-reality of film and like the absolute reality of the stories he's telling. And that just works with how we think about music and sound so much. And like what Dan and Tony did. So this is an absolute rare project. Like I've never worked on anything like this.
Yeah.
And it's like,
we got to do both. We got to do like record strings and piano and kind of combine the two feelings.
RaMell, I know you said that you don't coordinate, that you let your trusted artists go and do their own thing. But I feel like, to your point, the music, the score, and the sound design are in really powerful dialogue in this film, and they're both working off of each other. And I feel like the energy moves back and forth between. So I would love for whoever wants to jump in and address just that kind of that interplay between the sound design and the score in this film. It's so remarkable and effective.
I'll go real quick. I'd love to hear what you four think about it, especially from your positions of being the source of the music itself, or at least acknowledging that the music is in the world to be converted into something else. I think like for me, Hell County This Morning, This Evening is a better representation of someone's brain than anything I've seen, you know, like I think that's how we deal in impressions, we deal in abstract symbols, we deal in plurality, we deal in experience that then we then put narrative onto that then comfortably must align with our past, because if not, what is reality? It doesn't make sense. This is cause and effect. In Nickel Boys, what was like deeply interested in it is like pushing consciousness as a possible final site for the film. Like can the film mimic consciousness or be its own form of consciousness or whatever? Now, obviously, words are just words, and you can say that and it's like, whoa, that could be crazy, but like how do you practically do it? One way is you allow for the materials to exchange randomly or aleatorically, or you allow for chance and you allow for narrative to happen because two things were there at the same time because of opposite momentums. They just intersected simultaneously. The way that these guys work and the way that those guys work, like they don't need to be in like direct conversation because it's just sensibilities that I'm after. It's like them as people, as artists. And then like when you're walking down the street and like a couple of sounds just like make something that gets your attention, like that happens because that's what sounds do. They overlap, they make meaning regardless of whether or not you pay attention to it or you notice it, like the meaning's there. I asked them to make a lot of music. And I just know, like, I know these two people, like they're some of the kindest, like gentlest people. I know that what they do is emotionally meaningful and it will have a place in the film. And for these guys, they're so technically savvy and so aware of the way that sound just exists as one, a medium, because sound is different when it's in a film and different in the world, obviously. And to be able to like toggle between how it's going to affect someone, I think, and it as just some random thing is just, I don't know, just a rare skill. It's just so funny working with all these guys again on this because it's like such higher stakes, but it's the same process, essentially. It's just like giving it to them and being like, you know, what do you guys have? Yeah, I think there's just a lot of, is kismic? Is that the word, right? There's a lot of fortuitousness in our processes.
Just on a practical level, for you guys, were you hearing parts of the score as you guys were doing your mixing, your pre-mixing process, and sort of how was that? How were the two elements kind of talking to each other?
We always get early on some temp versions, I guess, of the score, 2-track versions usually, you know, mixed down. But for the final, the stems were delivered to us, so everything was delivered with multi-track stems, stereo stems, and that allows for a lot of creativity and sort of sound designing and kind of, you know, blurring that line between sound design and music, you know, so that a lot of times in the film, I think you can't tell whether is that music or is that sound design, or it doesn't really matter. They're both worlds colliding, as RaMell was saying.
I cannot let you go without talking about the White House sequence and Elwood being taken there with the other boys after he tries to break up the fight. I remember reading Colson's book and how horrific that scene was in the book. There's so many different ways, RaMell, that you could have shot that scene, approached that scene. I feel like it's an exercise in restraint, but I also feel like a lot of the power of the scene is coming through the sound design and the score. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about, RaMell, your decisions, how you framed that sequence, how you wanted to approach, you know, one of the more important sequences in the film, obviously.
Yeah.
And then for these guys, what, you know, how you leaned into the storytelling.
Like, I know before we make the film that the sound is going to be deeply complex and be, I mean, I almost like, I feel like this is the type of film where like every element of it is 100% and it's 100% overlapped. And so if you take out the way like these guys work, then the film still looks and like does its thing, but it's just missing 100% of what the like that sort of collapsing of sensibilities could be. Dan worked so long on this thing because it's so subjective, the going too far with the sound. Like you can go too far not showing it in a way in which it's so abrasively rendered that it pushes you away. But to find that perfect pitch, if that's even a way to say it, which is by no means perfect, but where you're not almost offending the audience, and you're trying to like hammer home maybe what it's like to remember the trauma. And you give it to someone with a patience like Dan. And I mean, I don't know how many hours, like 50, 30 hours of you just coming back and being like, you know, how's this? And like, I don't know, Dan, what do you think? And you're like, you're right. You know? And then you're like, you know, you go back and do it. And approaching it is, you know, it's interesting. When you first, the camera, like, it fundamentally objectifies. Scott and I are like deep photography heads. I think we were both taught like the camera points, like it points to what's important. That pointing is a form of othering, you know, it's a form of objectifying. We're used to watching trauma, but when people go through trauma, they're not watching themselves go through trauma. There's no mirror when you're being assaulted. And if it was, you're not looking in it, you know, like, so to see it and to use that as a source of empathy, I don't think those days are done, but I think that we're starting to understand that perhaps that almost allows it to be easier for that type of person or that person to continually have it happen because we're so used to seeing it when we've never seen it to ourselves, which is why when the people who are having it done to them see it done to people like them, they're like, what the fuck? You know, it's like different. My favorite thing to say about this, and this isn't even a question, is like Slavoj Žižek, I don't know how to pronounce it. He wrote this essay, Holiday from History, and in it, he's like, you guys, 9/11 was crazy. Like, sorry for saying this so tongue in cheek, but like dead bodies everywhere, like limbs falling from the sky. How many did you see? How many dead people, Americans, did you see after 9/11 on the news and on the internet right now? And when I read it, I was like, fuck, I thought I like paid attention to the world. I haven't seen one. I saw a picture of like a guy floating, falling head first, but like, I don't remember seeing any. People were getting hit by bodies. And then he's like, any disaster outside the US, how many dead bodies do you see? I was like, fuck, I've seen every one. I've actually like gone through galleries of like people that have been killed from the cartels. And like, I'm just like, oh, that's so sad. That's happening to them. Whew. Doesn't happen to us though. Photography produces reality, you know? It justifies our idealism, our exceptionalism about ourselves. And so once you realize, and once you say you don't want to do that, then you realize there's a million ways to do it other ways, but you just have to acknowledge that that's not necessarily the only way that could happen. And then sound was the first one because it's just so visceral. And you imagine when someone's going through something tragic, they're looking at details. I've had stuff happen to my body that's incredibly painful. I'm not staring at the screw that's broken out of my foot. I looked at it, I don't want to see it again. I'm like looking at the edge of the plank on a basketball court and like the dust that's like settling in the middle as a source of like solace in this moment of so much pain. And then as a person walks towards me, you know, coming from the ambulance, I like focus in on their shoes as they get closer as like a counting mechanism, you know? And so that's the approach, is like, what does it look like from the human perspective, not from the human perspective of watching other people go through it. And it's a sound thing.
Something you mentioned in there is like feeling desensitized to a lot of that stuff too,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's a big part of that scene for me, anyways. Is that you each hit you get a little more desensitized to it, and it's coming. Is it coming out of the wall of noise that's coming, or is it the inverse? It almost flips your senses like inside out, and then you're looking at the images. Is it a wall of 50-50 black and white? You're searching for meaning in them. You're searching for meaning
exactly. During the scene of trauma,
and you're
searching for meaning
to open up all their senses in that moment. It's nuts. Yeah.
And those are archival images of the Dozier School boys. Those are the real Dozier School boys whose faces are coming up. And maybe you knew that already, but I want to say that because why not ever before have we honored the people in a way that has some sort of grace, who are going through the things that we're entertaining ourselves over.
So for your senses to shut down and be wide open at the same time, I think is the power of that, and to end it with a digital clicks. I still don't know what that means. The mouse click.
I love what you said, Dan.
Scott and Alex, can you talk a little bit about the approach to scoring that sequence?
There actually isn't score in the sequence, and I think that was kind of a bold move in a way, like, or a brave move for RaMell, because I think that like in cinema you'd feel there'd be music, there'd be like tension, but
it's like all sound design.
It's all
Yeah, there's some deep pitches and stuff, but that is the sound design. It's almost music. It's not.
That was my reaction to it, which is, it's as you say, it's that moment where is this score or is this sound design? The deep pitches were something that I just presumed were music, but that's, it's wherever it comes from. It's fantastic stuff. And I think you're right. Putting a traditional score on that kind of sequence would have probably been horrible, right?
But like honestly, like horrible in a good way. It would have given people a different type of emotional reaction that would have been in the same space of other types of emotional reactions to trauma. And I'm sure people would have left the film being like, oh, it was devastating. Oh, that was horrible. You guys want to go to Chipotle? Or, like, yo, what we doing tonight? It's not funny, but like, it feels true.
Well, we have to get RaMell to another screening, but I did want to just give one final question for you, which is I know that you teach at Brown, you teach visual studies and film, and so I'm kind of curious, what do you tell your students about the importance of sound design and score and storytelling in film?
That's a good question. I use an anecdote that we came up with in thinking about Hell County. What if you approached film sound in the way in which you heard sounds in your head? What if you gave the film its own memory? What if when you're walking down the street, you hear every derogatory, mean thing every person has said to you in elementary school? You hear your mom's voice telling you this. You hear your dad telling you this. You hear this thing, this rap. Like, we're inundated by the silent sounds that we've digested our entire life in our head. And they pay dividends with the meaning that we're making. And so sound in film is easy to do one-to-one because it clarifies something for the audience and what they should take away. But if you're trying to have them take away something, I feel like something's if you're having them take away something, everything else is lost.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much for coming and talking to us and showing us this film. It's
Thank
fantastic work. RaMell, Scott, Alex, Dan, Tony, thank you so much. And thank you. Many thanks to RaMell, Scott, Alex, Daniel, and Tony for joining us for our special post-screening conversation. And an extra special thanks to our friends at Amazon MGM and the New York Film Festival for facilitating it. And if you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, please be sure you are subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. If you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head on over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining us.